we're recording the webinar, so if you happen to miss it or if you know of others that would benefit from it, we'll be posting that both on our external portal site with the Practitioners Network for Large Landscape Conservation, as well as on our internal National Park Service toolkit that we maintain. So with that said, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mark Wenzler, who will take the lead on the presentation for this afternoon. Thanks so much, Mark.
Great, thanks Cass. So my name is Mark Wenzler. I'm the Senior Vice President for Conservation Programs at NPCA. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. I know I see many Park Service folks on the line that we work with every day together trying to protect these awesome places. And so I just want to give you a little overview, but mostly we're going to be running through a series of examples of sort of beyond boundaries park protection that we have done at NPCA. I thought rather than listen to me talk about it, hear right from the horse's mouth, we've got three of our most experienced conservation advocates that will be doing very brief overviews to try to give you a flavor of the different ways that we approach landscape conservation of national parks. And so these are not exhaustive, but I think three very different examples just to give you a sense. So I wanted to start just with talking about, at NPCA, when we talk about landscape conservation, what does that mean? So, it's interesting because for us, we're not the Park Service, obviously, although sometimes people confuse us with MPS. But, we don't have any influence, really, or very little influence over what happens inside the boundaries of national parks. Almost all of our work has always been about what's happening outside their boundaries. That's where we, I think, have an ability to make a difference. So our mantra, as it were, for conserving parks is connect, protect, restore. If we can connect parks ecologically to their larger surrounding landscapes, protect them from threats of fragmentation and pollution, and restore damage that's already been done, we feel like that's really what we need to focus on. And if it's really the air, the land, the waters that surround and flow through national parks that are the focus point of our conservation works. And so if we can connect, protect, and restore the air, land, and water around the parks, then we feel like we're making a good contribution towards helping protect those parks in their landscapes. So with that said, I want to see if our first presenter, Don Barger, has been able to unmute himself. Don, can you? Looks like not. Cass, I think. So Don, are you there? Hello, Don?
And Mark, I just unmuted everyone, so Don should be able to speak at this point.
Don Barger? Okay, well, we are having some problems here. I really apologize. I'm going to skip ahead then we'll come back to Don, and we'll go to our second presenter first. Whoops, gone too far. So I want to introduce, first off, our California Desert Program Manager, David Lampham, also NPCA's new Wildlife Program Director. So David is one of our most seasoned advocates, working to protect park landscapes in the Mojave Desert. So David, why don't you take it away and give us our second case study.
Thanks, Mark. I guess the first thing I want to say is that it's really nice to meet you all, and thanks for your interest in this issue. As a former wildlife biologist, I want to say that I'm really astounded at how much we have collectively learned in the last decade about the natural world to better understand it and to understand how it works. And that might be related to understanding wildlife linkages or the relationships between pollinators or plants. And we're also understanding that the world is really changing. The reason that I bring this up is that while we have so much to learn, there's, I would say, two things that we know with certainty that make landscape work really critical. And one of those things is the more we learn, the more we understand the interconnectedness of the components of biological systems. We understand that ecosystems and species do not adhere to political boundaries, And that understanding, I think, imbues a responsibility to think creatively about how we can protect resources across these larger landscapes. The second point is that due to global climate change and the man-made changes that we've made to systems, resources may not act like they have in the past. They might actually literally not be where they were in the past. That might mean that a particular species can't find a plant that it needs to eat in order to fatten up for the winter. A tortoise might not find a plant that it needs in order to hibernate. Species may not be able to add the weight that they need to give birth because of changes to climate or resources that were available or are not currently available. And that these are real challenges, and these challenges require new thinking and new management actions to protect resources. What I really wanted to talk about today, I think, with that understanding is that, while the National Park Service, I think, does an excellent job in protecting their resources, we understand that public lands that are managed by a variety of federal agencies represent shared public resources, but that there's a difficulty in that different agencies have different mandates and missions, and they have different management plans. And it's really important to think across those different regimes to think about how we can look at these greater goals and to affect conservation for species and for natural systems. We're in a really unique scenario in the California desert where we're kind of ground zero for the development of renewable energy on public lands. And that has presented some real opportunities in really thinking about how we manage these larger landscapes and looking at multiple agencies coming together with stakeholders to try to think about these greater resources and how they can be managed. And what I'm going to talk about, I think in particular, is one case study, a landscape called the Silurian Valley. And Mark, so as you guys can see, this photo is a beautiful landscape of a beautiful photo of a landscape that is really the connective tissue between Death Valley National Park and Mojave National Preserve. And Mark, could you please change the slide? So I apologize if this map is a little hard to understand, but the red line that kind of bisects the map is the I-15, and south of that is Mojave National Preserve, which is the third largest park unit in the lower 48. The purple line outlines Death Valley National Park, which is the largest national park unit in the lower 48, and the green and the hashed areas in between are all protected wilderness areas or areas that are being proposed for wilderness. The Silurian Valley lies really right between number 4 and number 8. And in this entire landscape, it's one of the only places that didn't have any type of significant conservation designations. And unfortunately, a project was proposed, a very large solar project was proposed in that linkage. And within the Western Solar Plan, which is the country's first, foray into renewable energy policy, we actually developed the tools that gave the federal agency, the BLM, basically the power and the discretion to say no to what they and we believed was an inappropriately cited project. And so when you think about tools and you think about the need to develop tools, one of those tools is understanding the value of landscape and having those values weighted so that decisions can be made to support these types of outcomes. And so we saw that, what we saw was some really specific examples. So one thing that happened was there was basically a goal of interagency work and meetings, and because of that, the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a number of other agencies were able to come together and to share their science and to have a larger discussion about what the various values were in this particular landscape. So in the Silurian Valley, there was an understanding that this was one of the most pristine valleys in the California desert, that it had significant wildlife values for bighorn sheep and for desert tortoise, and that it also protected an incredibly important shared cultural resource, the Old Spanish Trail, which runs directly through the valley. And being able to bring agencies together to discuss values and to share science is, I think, not only a remarkable tool, but also a model. And as we think about this, we think about how, as we think about how to manage landscapes and how to manage these specific values, we understand that these are the types of conversations that need to occur, but that there's a crucial responsibility for us to actually protect these conversations happening. So to institute policies where it's a requirement that agencies are thinking about the larger regional goals in making decisions. And so, I wanted to share this as, there have been some difficulties in the California desert related to the siting of renewable energy. In this particular case, based on, I think, a shared approach, a tool has emerged that's really helped, at least in this particular scenario, help the agency make a really positive decision and to use landscape as kind of the thinking and justification behind protecting really important shared resources. I'll leave it there, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I will now advance to, wasn't advancing the slides, so just let me know when you want me to move the slides. So I want to introduce Nick Lund, who is our Senior Manager for Landscape Conservation and Energy. I think we all know that energy development in the last several years has really exploded across many of our public lands, not just the renewable type that David just talked about, but also oil and gas. And so I'm going to turn it over to Nick to talk about sort of what we're doing to protect park landscapes from that sort of energy development. Nick. Nick, if you're on mute, we can't hear you.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. This is Nick, and I want to say real quick that I have Don here on my cell phone speakerphone. So he was having some technical difficulties getting on, and so hopefully once I'm finished quickly, we can go back and Don can try to talk through the speakerphone through the magic of many internets, and we will make it work. So thank you very much, Mark. As you said, my name is Nick Lund. I work on energy issues here at NPCA, especially oil and gas. As folks know, national parks across the country lie on or near areas being developed for oil and gas. Much of the development out east is occurring on private lands near parks, but out west, national parks are surrounded by other federal lands. And so when we talk about this presentation about tools NPCA uses to encourage landscape conservation, the tool here that I'm going to talk about is trying to get agencies to work together on their landscapes. So yeah, Mark, if you could advance. Mark, if you could push it one. So intense oil and gas development is having an impact on national park resources and the visitor experience at parks that are surrounded by federal land. If we can get to the next slide, there we go. I'm just sort of go back one, that'd be great. I want to show some slides that illustrate sort of the impacts that's good right there. That some oil and gas development is having near parks around the country to show that it really is a landscape issue that we're dealing with. This image is taken at Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. This is the north boundary of the South Unit. And that line that runs diagonally across, sort of up from the bottom, is the park boundary. And so you can see sort of the proximity of 2 well pads here, and if we could draw back, there would be some more, the proximity to the park. And sort of this illustrates a number of issues on the landscape. So clearly there's the visual impact of wells and drilling rigs and infrastructure so close to the park. Secondly, we're concerned with if you can go back one, that'd be great. Thanks. Concerned with wildlife impacts. So, for example, illustrated on this slide, when you look on the left side of this slide, you see all these dots on the ground. Those are prairie dog holes, and you'll notice that those stop abruptly as we move to the right-hand side of the slide. So, wildlife that move in and out of parks are having their habitat impacted by rapid development going on. And third on this slide is water impact. So you'll notice a stream coming across the border there, running right next to the well pad. So if you could advance to the next slide. There are a number of other impacts on the landscape. We have air impacts. So this is also in North Dakota, just a bit north of where the previous slide was taken. An increase in necessary truck traffic puts particulate matters in the air. Also, there's a number of air impacts coming from wells and infrastructure. There's a flare burning on the left side of this slide that contributes, and other impacts there. So there are a number of impacts. You can advance the slide, please. And so what we can encourage agencies to do is work together to mitigate these impacts. One important tool that the administration developed in 2010 that we support is called master leasing plans. You folks may have heard of these tools. These are 2 maps showing progress of the master leasing plan going on called the Moab Master Leasing Plan near Arches and Canyonlands National Parks in Utah. On the left side there is a map that NPCA used as part of its stakeholder process to identify areas where drilling should and maybe shouldn't take place. The idea of agency cooperation on MLPs is that in areas of high conflict, such as high recreation use, high environmental values, especially around national parks, that the agencies, especially the BLM, which is doing planning processes, or RMPs, can get together and sort of work out in advance some of the controversies and difficulties that may come up as part of the leasing. So on the left is a part of that's the map of the viewshed that NPCA submitted showing areas that we thought should not be leased or should be subject to stipulations around arches and canyons. On the right side is one of the preliminary alternatives that the BLM released for the MLP probably a year and a half ago now. The red areas there are areas there that are proposed closed for leasing. The green areas are no surface occupancy, so a very sort of low impact on the viewshed. This is not a final alternative. We're still waiting to see how some of those will come out. I'm sure some folks on the phone have seen the progress. But NPCA is hopeful that this MLP and others like it will serve to sort of prevent some controversies and protect park landscapes in a number of ways without sort of fully depriving industry and the BLM of the jobs that they need to do on the landscape. If you can advance to the next one, Mark. So this is an example of sort of a tool that NPCA uses to stay on top of some of these landscape issues. This is a sort of a screenshot of a tool that we use to keep track of BLM planning processes. The large shaded areas are BLM field offices. We use those to keep track of where they are in their resource management planning processes. The circles show different stages of master leasing plans, either ones that are underway, like the orange up there, ones that have sort of been proposed, like the green there on Glen Canyon, and then blue are the ones that we are working on that we hope to be undertaken in the near future, Chaco and Mesa Verde area there. And so, NPCA really feels that when the Park Service speaks up for their resources and engages with their fellow agencies, that we have a really good shot at protecting national park landscapes from the impacts of oil and gas development.
Great, thanks, Nick. We'll try to go back now. And I apologize for this is a little bit cumbersome to get all the way back to the beginning, but we'll get Don Barger on here in a minute to talk about our first case study.
Don, do you want to say a few words to make sure we can hear you?
Yeah, how about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Does that work?
That's
Can
it.
folks on the phone hear that?
Yep.
All right.
All right, good deal. Well, the Scaling Up webinar last month talked about ways to think about landscape level management using statutes and authorities that are specific to the park system. What I'd like to do is show a couple of examples of where park managers have successfully protected their parks from impacts from projects outside their boundaries using authorities that are built into other laws that you might not think about in the day-to-day operation of the park. The reason that's important to think about this deliberately is illustrated by the use of the Federal Reserve water right to protect in-stream flow in parks. That authority has been used often in the West, much less so in the East, but due to the case law that's interpreted it, its use relies on a park manager being able to quantify the minimum amount of water needed to protect the principal purposes of a particular park. That's not the way you might normally generate data, but if your data can't be used to make those findings, you can't use that tool to protect in-stream flow. Mark, go ahead and give me the next slide. The first example is the Buffalo National River. About 15 years ago, the National River was threatened by a proposed water impoundment, a dam, on a principal tributary, Bear Creek, but over 15 miles outside the boundary of this linear park corridor. Next slide. The buffalo is protected by the language found in Section 7A of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, not because it was designated, but because that language was inserted into its authorizing legislation. It states not only that you can't directly impact the park with an impoundment, but also that you can't unreasonably diminish the values for which the area was set aside. But it doesn't define unreasonably diminish, and it doesn't say according to whom. The Army Corps of Engineers had routinely dismissed Park Service concerns until this situation developed. In this case, the Park Service was able to establish a direct hydrologic connection between the dam and the river, although it's 15 miles away, and the NPS was willing to take the position that they, and not the Corps of Engineers, were the appropriate authority to make the determination required by this statute. When the Corps of Engineers refused to acknowledge that authority, NPCA and its allies filed a lawsuit resulting in a determination that, in fact, the Army Corps of Engineers could not approve a dam 15 miles outside the boundary of the Buffalo National River until and unless the NPS first determined that the dam would not unreasonably diminish the values protected by the river. Next slide. The dam was never built, and today the Buffalo National River and other parks to whom this language applies have this protection to the full reach of their watershed, pictured here, outside of their boundaries. There may be other parks around the country which are not even aware of the fact that they may also have this protection. Next slide. The second example that I was involved in was at Cumberland Gap National Historical Park. The area you see here is an old National Park Service map, and you can see just south of the Middlesboro, Kentucky, which is the yellow area there, is the Fern Lake watershed, kind of to the west outside the park. It's 1994, and even though it's outside the park, the Fern Lake watershed is the most prominent feature of the historic landscape seen from the pinnacle. Next slide. The park's principal overlook viewpoint from which this photograph was taken. Due to my background as a coal field community organizer, I was contacted by the park staff when it was learned that the mountainsides surrounding the lake were proposed to be strip mined for coal, a scar that would run completely around the contour above the lake. Interestingly, Fern Lake is also the water supply for Middlesboro, Kentucky. So after a little consultation, NPCA and the city of Middlesboro jointly filed a formal administrative petition to have the Fern Lake watershed declared unsuitable for mining. Section 522 of the Surface Mining Act also says that a permit cannot be approved if it would adversely affect a national park, but that term had never been applied to an historic landscape. In support of our petition, the park had a visitor survey conducted that established conclusively that visitors would indeed be adversely affected by the viewshed being devastated by mining, a finding for which the Office of Surface Mining had absolutely no counter. Final slide. The bottom line is that our petition was successful, so successful, in fact, that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and House Appropriations Chairman Hal Rogers introduced the legislation to add the Fern Lake watershed to Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, and yours truly was designated as an official admiral in the old Yellow Creek Navy of Middlesboro, Kentucky. These are just a couple of examples of the successful use by park managers of differing authority to protect the resources of the parks from beyond boundary threats. NPCA has, and we are continuing to look at a variety of such tools that may be developed or deployed to protect the landscapes in which parks exist and upon which they depend. That's it for me.
Great, thank you, Don. I should have noted that Don is our Senior Regional Director for our Southeast region and one of our most seasoned advocates, and thank you very much, Don. So those are just a few examples, of the sort of issues that we tackle every day, working with our Park Service partners, and there are many, many more. We wanted to just conclude with what are the opportunities on the horizon. Obviously, these are ongoing efforts to protect our parks from all these beyond boundary threats. I want to turn it over to Sarah Barmeyer, who is our Senior Managing Director for Conservation Programs at NPCA, just to give you a flavor of kind of what's out there, what's on the horizon, things that we may all be working on together coming up in the near future. So Sarah, take it away.
Sure. Hi, guys. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to talk about, as Mark said, some of the opportunities on the horizon, but specifically with on the national policy level. And I think we all know it's important for parks to have a voice in decisions that may affect parks and park ecosystems. And I know that the Park Service doesn't really advocate for specific roles, but they do play a very important role in educating about impacts of things and letting the public as well as Congress and the administration, other agencies know how things may affect parks. So I'm going to first talk about a couple of rulemakings that are taking place and coming up where MPS has played an important role. Sometimes we hear from agencies that they didn't even think about parks and how parks might be impacted by their decisions. So it's always important to weigh in with parks. One is the Clean Water Protection Rule with the EPA. Because many park waters originate outside of park boundaries, a lot of things happen upstream from parks. It's important for the Park Service to talk with EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers to talk about which parks are protected under the Clean Water Act. And the Park Service did provide comments on the rule, which is fantastic. It's explained the park's role and how the rule can help provide clear science and a legal framework for determining which parks are protected. And we definitely encourage the Park Service to continue engaging with this rule as it keeps going, because the implementation is going to be so important for ensuring which headwater streams and tributary streams outside of parks are going to be protected. Another example of a rule is with the Regional Haze Rule, and by the end of this year, EPA is expected to propose revisions and guidance to the Regional Haze Rule. And over the years, the Park Service has submitted comments and advocated for strong cleanup plans. And we hope to see this again this time around so that we can have a really strong rule that ensures that parks area will be protected and restored to natural conditions. And staying with the Regional Haze Rule, for example, with the program itself, for nearly a decade, specifically in Utah, Utah has been drafting regional haze plans that really fail to require pollution reduction standards that are needed to protect parks at places like Arches, Zion, and Canyonlands. And the Park Service's Air Resources Division submitted comments, and comments after comments, urging the state to require meaningful reduction, but to no avail. Well, in a recent unprecedented move, 5 Utah park superintendents got behind the Park Service's regional office, prompting a letter to the state and EPA urging pollution mitigation for 2 power plants. This letter was widely noticed by the agency as well as the media. And while we don't know what EPA's decision is going to be on the weak Utah haze plan right now, it's clear that the voices of the Utah parks will be a significant factor in this decision. So going forward, having superintendents play this important role of advocating on these positions it's well received and noticed as well. And Mark, you can go to the next slide. I briefly want to touch on some national legislation as well. And unfortunately, we're working in a political climate that doesn't always prioritize environmental protection, and we're often scrambling to try to understand how negative impacts to proposed legislations what they would have on parks, and then go educate Congress and the public about these problems. Two current examples of legislation that we're working to try to understand. Recently, legislation has been introduced in reaction to the proposed marine reserve that was recently finalized in the Biscayne General Management Plan. This legislation would basically give states veto authority over any fishing access restrictions in coastal and Great Lakes parks and national marine sanctuaries. Another example is legislation that would remove ballast water regulations from Clean Water Act, which could hurt a lot of like harbors and areas around aquatic parks. So we've been, working with the Park Service to try to understand early how this national legislation could affect parks and lands is so important for educating the public and Congress on why these just don't make sense, why these should never become laws. And if we're coming from NPCA, I know that we can handle the advocacy side, but it's really, really important to hear and understand early what from the experts what this could mean, what impacts this means for parks before they really gain traction. And just to close, these are just a few of the things sort of on the national scene, but I also want to mention, you have a very supportive non-governmental community out here with NPCA, many other organizations, to help echo the messages that you have and enhance the message that you have into more of an advocacy position. So, feel free to call on us and use us as you can going forward.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Cass. That concludes our NPCA presentation. I apologize we went over a little bit because of some of the technical problems, but Cass, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. And thanks to all the speakers today for giving us some insight on some of the tools that NPCA uses in their large landscape conservation efforts, everything from authorities to planning documents and beyond. So at this time, we have unmuted everyone. If you do have a question, feel free to just go ahead and speak up. We'll take about 5 to 10 minutes or so of questions, depending on the interest. And if you're unable to be heard for some reason, feel free to plug it into the chat, and we'll make sure that the presenters have a chance to answer those as well. Does anyone want to kick us off with any questions for NPCA?
Hey, Cass, this is Tom Olive.
Hey, Tom.
I just want to make sure you can hear me. Wondering if NPCA is on the steering committees of any of the LCCs, the Landscape Conservation Cooperatives?
Tom, this is Mark Wensler. I don't believe that we are. I think it would be a good place for us to engage. I think it's in many cases a resource issue. A lot of our regional offices sometimes are 1 or 2 people staff, as you know. And so I think if there's a particular place where you think it would be very helpful to have us engaged, let us know. We're always willing to shift our priorities where we can to help out where we're needed. So I think if there's an opportunity that it would make a difference to have us, let us know.
Okay, would that
Mark,
be
this is Don Barger. I would say Chris Watson on my staff is participating in the South Atlantic, working on the Ocmulgee River corridor, and I have an interviewee for a job standing outside my door who I intend to put on to the Appalachian LCC.
Oh, great. Thanks, Don. I wasn't aware of that.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Cass, this is John Putnam with International Affairs. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I just wanted to ask NPCA if you're looking at all at sort of transbounding, really long-distance international traveling migratory species. That takes connectivity in large landscapes up to a whole different level from what I think we've been talking about today. Are you looking at some of those issues involved with protecting species that maybe travel thousands of miles from Alaska to Patagonia, for example?
David, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. So, I guess the simple answer is that, we are working on a number of kind of trans-border international issues, but I don't think that we've taken up the mantle yet of the larger, connectivity, whether it be whales in the Pacific Ocean or, or the, the warbler that you might see in Costa Rica after you saw it come through the California desert. But it is something that I am aware of and that we are thinking about. I don't think that we've made a full foray, but I think we are specifically working right now on national parks connectivity issues on the Canadian border and on the Mexican border.
Yeah, this is Don again. I would add to that, and we're currently working on another lands unsuitable petition, this time in the headwaters of the Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area. And one of the principal pieces of proof that we've got that this 500 miles of ridgeline should be taken off limits to mining, thus protecting beyond boundary the flow of water into the Big South Fork, is the use by this area of Sterlian warblers. And we've had avian experts come in and do surveys, and we've submitted formal comments to that effect. We've been involved with that.
Great, thank you very much.
Great. Any other questions for the NPCA staff?
I guess I'd just like to add one more comment to this last question. I think this last question was a really excellent one, and I think it speaks to really kind of the direction that we all need to be heading in terms of thinking about how species use landscapes and what parts the landscapes that we manage or have influences over play in that. And so it seems like in addition to taking protection actions in the United States and maybe even further, there's also, I think, an incredible opportunity for citizen science to make sure that we really understand what the use is and how many birds are using particular sites, if that's changing, and if we have to think about if we have to modify how we manage. So thanks again for that question. I think it's a really great one.
More sometime.
Thanks, David. Okay, well, just to wrap up real quick, certainly thanks on behalf of the National Park Service to all the presenters today with excellent information that hopefully folks will find helpful in their work with large landscape conservation. I did plug in a number of resources that I think folks may find helpful, a couple links for the National Parks Conservation Association, also a link to our practitioners network for large landscape conservation pages that live on that joint site. If you're with the National Park Service and you haven't found our toolkit yet, I did plug in a link to that. There's additional information on past and upcoming webinars located on both the external site and the internal site. And then the last link that I did plug in, if you haven't joined our email list, we send a new newsletter that's coming out every other month, which features different stories or case studies from around the nation, as well as upcoming webinar issues. So once again, thanks for joining us today. Our next webinar is scheduled for September 9th at 12 Pacific, 3 Eastern, featuring Tom Olaf from the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative. So please plan to join in for that. Thanks again.
Thank you.